episode 3 of Flosstube University, which is where we do small tutorials to help beginner cross stitchers, mostly for people who have bought patterns from our Etsy shop, but putting them on YouTube so that anybody has access to them. Today we're going to talk about what is the best counts of fabric to buy for and use for your full coverage cross stitch pieces. Before we dive into today's topic, we want to mention we have these tutorial videos, but we also have a Flosstube, and a Flosstube is where stitchers share the things that they are working on. So every other Monday we post a video that's like an in-depth fun video of like our current stitching lives, and we'll show all of the things we have finished, all the things. Our most recent finish or two.
We do have them occasionally. So.
New things we started, things we're currently working on, start-alongs, fun things, the community, the stitching community. And the stitching community on YouTube is really fun and vibrant. Yeah. So if you're finding this video because you're trying to learn, but you haven't ever watched like a Flosstube, subscribe, because those videos come out every other Monday. And also we often
talk about other Flosstube, so you'll find some other really good people to watch. It's really fun.
And then the other Mondays, the Mondays between those Flosstube episodes, we put out deep dives that are aimed more at advanced or
people who've been
stitching for a while, where we talk about topics like we might just go into one designer, or we just put out a video on the most expensive cross stitch patterns. And most beginners don't start with
the most expensive
cross stitch patterns, but you might be interested in learning things like that too. And so definitely subscribe. We would love to have you stick around. All right, let's talk about you're going to do a full coverage piece. Maybe it's your first full coverage piece, or maybe it's your first one that's not a kit and you have to get the supplies yourself, which we call kitting it up yourself. And you might want to know like what count of fabric makes sense for you to buy. Or you might not even, you might get to the store like me the first time and be like, there are different counts?
There are. There are. And they matter a lot.
And it matters.
Yeah.
It's not, there are times when you could buy the wrong count and be totally fine, and there are times when it will ruin.
It just won't work.
It will ruin your piece.
It won't look good. The frame will be ridiculously big.
You won't be able to frame it because it'll be off. Like you won't have enough margin on one side. If you're lucky that it fits at all.
That it fits at all. So I've been there. So
first thing you want to look at is what is your piece charted for, and that means what was the cross stitch chart created. Like what size of fabric was the cross stitch chart created for?
What was its intended size?
And it will usually say right on there, like, we recommend a 14 count. The model was stitched on a 14 count, or this is charted for a 14 count, or it'll be in a supplies
designed
list
for this count.
Right.
So,
And 14 count is the most common. What are other ones that are common?
For full coverage, so 14, 16, 18 are probably your most common ones.
Where you'll actually see it say like, this is what this is for.
Charted in.
Yeah.
I haven't come across one charted in 20, but I'm wondering if some of the very, very large cross-stitch full coverage ones, like a Heaven and Earth Designs company, those might be more commonly converted to 20.
And
I
also
don't know if
sometimes
they're commonly charted like that.
Sometimes companies will be like, this is the stitch count, you decide what you want to do.
Go for it, yeah.
And then and even if it's charted for one count, you can change the count as long as you know what that's going to do. And we just put out, our last tutorial was all about like explaining cross stitch counts, but specifically for fabric counts and cross stitch, but specifically for full coverage. The reason you might want to take something charted for 14 and switch it to a 20 yourself is if the 14 count is going to be this big and you want it to be this big, because the larger the piece, the more expensive the fabric is. Sometimes it's even hard. It can be hard to find fabric of a certain size, especially if you want to like go to a box store and kit it up that day.
Yeah.
You may not, and you don't want to buy like a specialty half yard of fabric somewhere. You may want it to be smaller.
You may need it to be smaller.
And then also framing, like the larger the piece.
You have enough space on your wall for that 4 foot by 4 foot cross stitch? I don't.
And it's not going to change the number of stitches in the piece. It will only make it so that they take up less space because the stitches will be smaller. Right. The higher the count, the smaller the stitch when you're talking about Aida. And Aida is the type of fabric that is a 14 count or a 16 count. Now.
And I think that most full coverages probably use Aida. I don't know. I don't know what the benefit would be to choosing a linen unless it's just your preferred.
I don't see people stitching full coverage on linen. People do stitch it on Lugana all the time. And the
Lugana is different.
Yeah. So if you want it to be even smaller, let's say the 20 count is not going to work for you. It's still going to be too big for your personal preferences. Some people will then go out and buy a 25 count fabric and they will stitch that, what we call 1/1. So they'll do one thread over one. They'll do one thread of floss over one fabric thread, and those stitches are teeny tiny. And the benefit is to make these really big full coverage pieces smaller. Now, Allison and I tend to do full coverage that are more manageable to begin with.
This is probably one of my small.
So this is Allison's wedding flowers that she charted. This is one of the patterns that are for sale that I charted. This is only 4,000 stitches. And then this one is much, do you know how many stitches that
I don't know how many stitches.
It's a lot more stitches. But
it's a lot more.
But there are pieces out there in the world that are beautiful, that people stitch, that are this big. And so the benefit of then deciding, you know what, I don't want a 3-foot thing. I want it to be 2 feet or whatever, and doing the math and figuring out, okay, well, if I do it on 25 count and I have 25 stitches per inch because I'm doing it over one thread, it will be this size.
It does take a little bit of math, but there are really good apps out there. I have a calculator app just for cross stitch.
Yeah, and so for me, it's like, okay, if I'm gonna do it over one, so like a 14 count or an 18 count, then it's just divide it by 14 or 18 or whatever, and you know how many inches wide and tall your piece is going to be. If you're doing it over 2 threads, so there are people that will do full coverage on a 28 count Lugana, but they're going to do it over 2 threads. That makes it the same as a 14 count, because even though they have 28 threads, every stitch is covering 2 of them, so it's the same size stitch as a 14 count.
Right.
And we don't have any Lugana here, and this is not full coverage, but just to show you an example, this is a 28 count piece of linen, but the stitches on this guy and the stitches on this are the same because this is 14 count Aida and this is 28 count linen. So this is over 1, this is over 2. Those stitches are actually the same size. But if I were to do it over 1, this would be teeny tiny. And some people will do that for full coverage to make their pieces small. I haven't really seen anybody go higher than a 28 count Lugana on full coverage, but
not on full coverage.
I mean, there's 40. I guess you could do like a 40 count Overdoll 1/1, and it would be tiny.
You'd have to have really good eyesight if you're gonna do over 1.
Ooh. And there are some people that do really, really, really big full coverages, and they try to get them as small as possible, and then they do like 50 of them, and that's the type of stitching they do. Whereas
it's so cool, but
we do a mix.
Eyes would.
When we chart our own patterns, we tend to chart full coverage. Allison is thinking of dabbling in the world of charting non-full coverage.
We'll see.
But there are pieces, that are not full coverage, things like samplers and things where you have a lot of the fabric showing through, and that's where people tend to use like nicer linens and things. When you're talking about doing full coverage, you're talking about fabric, you're really more concerned with the count, and is it gridded, or do you have to
or are you going to grid it yourself?
And if you don't know about gridding, the world of gridding and the world of pre-gridded fabric, subscribe, because we do have videos that are going to come out about that in the next few months.
Right.
All right. Is there anything else people need to know about choosing the fabric count for their full coverage?
The only other thing I would say, the most important would be the stitch count. But the second is, if you want any of the border to show, make sure you consider that before you get started. Because if I don't frame mine with anything showing at all. Like I go straight up to the stitches.
That. So this is 2 frames.
No,
like it's an inner like. Well, okay, I'm sorry. It's an inner like metal.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's an inlaid.
It's really cool.
Thing. But the stitching goes right to the border. But if you wanted like a white border,
there are people
choose
this
white
isn't full coverage, but there are people who would do something where like the interior would be all full coverage, but then they would let their fabric show through. And you can do that for a white Aida. It doesn't have to be a fancy fabric to let it show through.
Right, you can. But if you wanted it like a different color,
So if you wanted
consider
to do like a fabric border, Allison has some really cool Aida fabrics, which pull out the green one. Allison's got some, like, Allison stitches primarily on Ada, whereas I do a really big mix. But I guess I'm primarily a linen stitcher, except when it comes to full coverage. But when Allison stitches on Ada and she's doing things where the fabric is going to show, she'll pick really cool colors, and then, but you could do a full coverage on a colored piece like this if you wanted the border to show. That would be
Word
cool.
to the wise, stitching on black is harder than stitching on regular colors. The darker the fabric, the harder it is to see the holes. So, full coverage, I would just not.
20 count black full coverage sounds.
I would not do full
like
coverage
my nightmare.
on black. That would be my piece of advice.
So I think that's everything you need to know about like picking what fabric count you want for your full coverage. Do the math on look for what's charted, what it says to do it on. Then do the math and see, like, is that a piece of fabric I want to buy? Is that a finished size that I want to have? And make it smaller or larger by buying higher or smaller count fabrics based on what you then want to change. In the beginning, you may just go for what's charted, what's called for.
And I kind of suggest that just because if you're a beginning, see what feels right. Try somebody else's.
But it's very common for people who are even primarily Ada stitchers to settle into like a 16 or an 18 count as their primary and not a 14.
Right.
But I think we started on 14 count. I think most people start on 14 count. And if that's what's called for, then start with it and see how you like it. And then go smaller if you want to later.
Yeah.
All right, definitely if you want any of those future tutorial videos, or if you want to see our personal stitching or our deep dives into the wide world of cross stitch on YouTube, subscribe. And other than that, thanks so much. Bye guys.
Bye.